This is a production of WKNO Memphis. Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
A look at the future and the past of Beale Street tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. We are joined tonight by John Elkington, who developed Beale Street some 30 years ago. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
Also Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. And Lee Harris from the Memphis City Council. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks for inviting me.
The city, we're in a kind of at the end of a long legal process, I guess. It seems like we're close to the end here.
It's longer for me.
Longer for you, yes, than for me. I think probably more painful for you than for me, and so on. Well, I'm going to start with it looks like at this point the city is going to take over if the settlement kind of goes through the way it seems it's going to go through. Is Beale Street, is it a good thing? Let's say that there's change in leadership, a new direction. Maybe it didn't happen the way you would have liked, but is it, does every kind of big enterprise like a Beale Street need a change in leadership at certain points?
Well, we've been involved in Beale Street for 32 years. I took it when there was nothing there. It was boarded up, and there were two businesses on Beale Street, Hutkins Hardware and Schwab's, and we had to create a vision for it, and we had to go find tenants, and people didn't believe it would ever happen because there had been 4 false starts that didn't work, and so I think it was good in that sense. 4 years ago, as Bill will know, I went to the city and said, look, I'm 60 years old. I'd like to leave, and why don't we look? And we were starting a plan, and then suddenly, I think the lawsuit between the Beale Street Development Corporation and the city, somehow we got entrapped in all of that. But I think it is good. We need new vision. We need to expand the district, and we had started that with the expansion of the Westin Hotel 4 years ago, and as Bill will remember, we went to the legislature to get the rules of Beale Street, the various times and so forth, expanded all the way to the river. So I think it's always great to have new leadership, younger leadership, and not just in what I do, but in the clubs and the venues that are there. I mean, a lot of the people there are over 60. They've been there a long time. We have new entertainment, new ideas, and I think change is good in many respects.
Okay. Lee, so the city will, if the settlement plays out, the city takes back control. Do you as city council, you guys have a lot on your plate. You got a lot of expenses. There's a whole lot going on. We were talking before the show about, problems even just with trash collection, and now you've got this very complicated, very expensive enterprise that the city's going to take back. Do you look forward to that?
Yeah, I look forward to it. I think one of Memphis's comparative advantages is tourism, and I think Beale Street represents all that's good about tourism in the city of Memphis. And so I think this is one of the places where we can really make our mark, is moving Beale Street forward. And so I think there's some opportunity. Are there some challenges? Sure. I think going forward is how we pace ourselves. And I think going forward, maybe we should pace ourselves a little bit more carefully and deliberately. So maybe we don't swing for the fences, but there are opportunities on Beale Street. And I think it matches up with where Memphis is right now, is where we're going to maximize, we're going to identify what our priorities are, identify what our advantages are. Tourism is one of them, and we're going to try to maximize those, but do it at a slow and deliberate pace. So maybe, so this is an opportunity, but maybe it's an opportunity maybe this is not the moment to swing for the fences. But It's the moment to take care of some housekeeping matters to kind of decide which direction Beale Street's going to go, and how do we tie Beale Street into the rest of the community and to, into the Memphis brand. And
it's been talked about, there are a couple options, and you can clarify where we're going, but the city managing Beale Street or hiring a private developer, a private company. There's been talk of a company out of Baltimore that did the Inner Harbor redevelopment there, other companies. Which direction would you personally, or from your seat, like to see the city go? Manage it, keep control of it, or find an outside company to manage it?
Sure. So there's some options on the table, and I think the mayor is, after the litigation is concluded, which is hopefully imminent. It's going on a lot longer than I've been around for, and John has been around this process for a lot longer than I have. But the mayor has promised that as soon as this litigation is concluded, that he'll bring some options to the table for the council. I think you've identified a bunch of them, whether or not the city's going to manage it or whether they're going to outsource management to a private group. My gut intuition is that with a product like this, you've got to have an external manager manager that is always committed and focused on making sure that the project is successful. Now the question becomes whether or not that should be a for-profit operation or not-for-profit. My guess is probably not-for-profit. And so, whether or not you can set up some sort of agency with city ties, sort of like the Downtown Memphis Commission or the Visitors Bureau or some such, is probably the direction I'd like to see us go with development and really meeting the opportunities on the street. I'm not sure that the next manager of that street should be a for-profit operation, because again, from my perspective, and I've just come to this, for-profit operations are going to, risk seek. And I'm not sure that this is the time to swing for the fences, to go for the home run per se. It's more important to make sure that we can handle Beale Street and we can tie that street into the rest of the community and our real comparative advantage in tourism.
Do you have thoughts on, what would you like to see happen in terms of a future?
Well, I recommended to Mayor Harrington 4 years ago that we set up a Vous Courez Commission like they have in New Orleans, where you basically have the council has represented, the city's represented, the merchants on Beale Street have some representative, and I think that's very important. You got to remember, Beale Street's pretty well set now. We're 94% occupied. We just have some office space that's vacant. We have no receivables. We have no payables, or very little payables. It's in great sense. It was just picked as the icon street of America. We're so far down the road, but I think we got to remember who goes to Beale Street. We have 4 groups that go to Beale Street. We have basically leisure travelers, those people that live within 200 miles of Memphis. That's continuing to grow, and they come here and they're attracted by our different attractions, as Lee said. And then we have conventioneers. Well, conventioneers, our convention center is substandard, truthfully, and we're going to have to address that. Our airport, we're certainly not have enough flights, and the flights are not cheap enough to be a major convention center. So I think we've got to look at, what are we going to do about conventions here? Because that's the second major group. The third are what we call recreational tourists, and those are people who take their kids and go to soccer tournaments and baseball tournaments, and I think the city's moving with that. I think a good idea in improving the fairgrounds as a multi-sports facility. So I think that's good. And then you have people in the MSA that, and in an MSA where 40% of the people, are in or below the poverty line, we've got to figure out how we expand that economic growth. How do we get more people who can afford to go there? Yeah. And I think all those are issues.
Bill.
So Lee is a nonprofit entity of some kind, an interim step, a short-term entity, or a long-term entity that is kind of the future of where we're going here?
Well, again, I'm going to wait for the mayor's options, but I've got to say that my gut impression is that in almost all of our valuable assets at the city, in the city ambit, that I'm against for-profit managers with long-term contracts. And so Beale Street is no different. And so, a long-term contract, a 10-year contract, a 20-year contract, a 30-year contract with an external manager that is for-profit is probably not something I could support. And so, while I wait for the mayor's option, what I would like to see is a nonprofit or a quasi-city agency that manages development and meets the challenges on Beale Street over the long term.
John, in the late 70s, when you were approached about this, if it had been a short-term lease, would you have taken it on?
Oh, no. But it was a different time. It was an abandoned thing. We had to finance it. We had a bunch of shells. So we had to figure out a way to do it. And the only way you could was basically give an assignment of your rents to a lender. And that was the only financing, because the city cannot subordinate their property. So we had a situation that was very difficult. We couldn't get tax credits. The historical tax credits would have been helpful, but the buildings were in such disrepair, they weren't available to us. Mm-hmm. So we had to, kind of piece it together. That's why we put so much equity in the property initially. Everyone always thinks the city has all this money in the property. They don't. They have $600,000. The money came from the federal government and came $3 million from the state government, and all of the merchants and Performa and all the different entities put in about $16 million. So that's where the money came from. And it had to be equity. That's why it was so hard leasing up, as you remember, Bill, mm-hmm. because you had to go to someone and you couldn't get, you had to either pay for it or have them pay for it.
And also, at some point, you determined it, and you had actually you were talking to the founders of Overton Square.
Right.
At one point, who were actually approached by the city at one point about running this and didn't want it. And they actually told you, you're not only gonna have to manage it, you're gonna have to get into the restaurant business.
Right, and we actually, when we were at the darkest day, and things weren't working, and we didn't have what we wanted, I went to my friend Preston Lamb and said, look, we're gonna have to put some money together and get in the restaurant business, which we did. Of course, I got out of it immediately because I thought it was a conflict for us to be in that business. But I can tell 100 great stories about how depressed it was when we first started. I don't think you could do what we did today because we didn't have bloggers, we didn't have tweeters, we didn't have all these people who are constantly criticizing you. I had the commercial appeal, which was enough, but it was difficult in those days, and it would have been impossible today. I'll say one thing, and because you and I have been friends and we've seen this thing for years and years, and you've progressed and you worked on Beale Street. The big problem was no one believed in it. I mean, I remember the day we were open, and I had a call, and they said, "Are you really opening today?" And that's the thing. And I look at it today and say, "Hey, you're the icon street in America. We've solved all the problems. But what we need to do, and that's why I'm for a nonprofit. Also, I agree with Lee. I think you need to have a body that's consistent, that will be there, that won't have sudden changes, and because it's a stable thing. It's not like we got to go rent a bunch of new space out. We need to expand it, and we need to continue the movement south, I believe, and the movement west and east too. And I think that's very important. We've had all this about the Plush Club. We're going to tear it down. Nothing's happened. We're still where we were a year ago, except shutdown. But I think we need consistent plans of where we're going. And I think when I was involved, one guy made the decisions basically, and that was probably not good. But I got all the criticism, so I guess I got to make the decisions.
How do you avoid, go back to this idea of the city being involved in a nonprofit, how do you avoid, as John just said, one person in charge, that's kind of more he takes the criticism or he takes the success. How does the city get involved and not run it by committee? And that every city councilman, no disrespect to you, but you've got all these different city council people have different points of view, and they want to close this club, or they like this, or they don't. How do you not run it by committee? Because I don't think anyone would say that's going to be the way that's going to make it successful.
No, man, I think you're right, man. But I think there's a role for the city council to play, and I obviously I'm a little biased, but I'd like to see city council involved in some sort of scrutiny of how this goes forward, some sort of overview of this. I think we've got models. I think the Downtown Memphis Commission, they manage their day-to-day operation. They have a dedicated revenue source, but they still come to the city council and to city government at least once a year so we can go over the budget and how they're spending their resources. And so that kind of periodic process and interaction, I think, is a good thing. I think it's good for everybody. Because I trust bureaucrats at city government in some respects, but I also trust elected officials. And I think if you bring all the elected officials, the city council and the mayor, and you give them all some role to play here, and obviously not a day-to-day role. We've got to have a manager, somebody to do day-to-day operations. But if you give them a role to play, I think that the scrutiny is going to be a good thing for Beale Street, and it's going to really eliminate a lot of the risk taking, which I think is probably a bad idea.
Do you think, though, that some critics would say that the city has gotten too involved in these essentially private enterprises, from the pyramid redevelopment, the fairgrounds, now getting into Beale Street, now redevelop. That these things ought to be much more just pure private enterprise. If they don't work, they don't work. Talk now of getting involved with AutoZone Park, the baseball stadium. Should the city be this kind of financer of all these essentially private activities?
Well, I think Beale Street is a little bit different. I think the city owns Beale Street, and so I think that's a public asset. And so for the city to be a part of the development of Beale Street is a good idea. If it's one thing that we do well, it is tourism. And we've really got to, over the long term, we've got to focus our attention on tourism. Forget chasing industrial dollars. That's the white rabbit you never catch. Forget all that type of stuff. Where we are going to really attract people into this town and attract dollars is going to be through tourism. And so that's got to be our number one priority. So Beale Street is slightly different. Now the rest of the projects, you're right. It is strange. It is strange and a little bit scary. that the reach of city government extends so far, and that we should probably dial it back, and we should concentrate on our core priorities.
Right.
Beale Street tourism is one of those, and there are several others. Obviously, the plain vanilla stuff that city governments do, but the rest of this stuff is strange.
But in your role as a developer of Beale Street, I suppose you like that the city is investing in the Pyramid because it's going to bring more people downtown. You mentioned the fairgrounds. I mean, I suppose even though you're in the private sector, do you like seeing the city make these kinds of investments?
I don't think the city ought to be investing in a baseball stadium, and I don't think the city should do a lot of the things that they do. But I think I treat and I see Beale Street as a finished product that has that opportunity to expand and do other things. It's not like it's a basket case. No one has said we haven't done a good job. It basically is an opportunity to expand it. And I think by getting the input of a lot of people, I'm not just saying government should be involved, I'd get private individuals. But I disagree with you about tourism. I think we're not as good as we've been in tourism. I think tourism is slack because of our convention situation here. We don't have any major conventions. I'm involved in a project right now in St. Louis, and last week Kojic was there, and all the restaurants were busy, all the hotels were busy. I don't think we're doing that. It's not a criticism of anybody, but it's just simply we need to pay attention to our infrastructure here as far as tourism. Graceland, the people in Graceland are aging. Beale Street, the people are aging. All the things that have made us an attraction are starting to get some hair on them. And I think we need to pay attention to all of those issues. We don't have the problems we had 30 years ago about, well, is it going to survive? Are they going to make it through the winter? We're beyond survival. We're now in a situation, how do you make it bigger? How do you make it better? How do you expand it from 3 blocks to 6 blocks to 8 blocks? How do you make it really something special? It is special, but it can be much better. And I think that's what you've got to do. And I don't think hiring a person from government to run is the best way to do it. But I think a board that reflects, and as I was on the Center City Commission for 8 years, I think a board like that has the input is very important.
Okay. Bill.
Lee, you've heard the talk about the convention center. There's been some talk about expanding it where it is, even though it's kind of landlocked on 3 sides, and it might involve moving an interstate ramp. There's always been talk about going north of the Beale Street district, that area between Union and Beale Street. Where are you on this, kind of at the outset of the wheels moving on it?
Well, as I said, I think tourism is one of the places where we have a comparative advantage, and so I'd like to do things that promote tourism and attract visitors to Memphis. I think that the convention center plays a role in that, and so I think if we had the financial capacity to do something with respect to the convention center, then we should probably do it. Now, I don't think we have the capacity right now, so I think that's got to be part of a long-term vision. I think the more immediate priorities that we could actually touch and get something done on right now are things like hotel rooms. We can do something about hotel rooms probably now. I mean, for example, if you move west down, If you move west down Beale Street, there is property. And the question is, why don't we have a hotel there on Beale Street? I mean, things like that I think could occur. I mean, we've got a brick and mortar bank on Beale Street. Why isn't that brick and mortar bank a nice boutique hotel? The Elvis Presley restaurant and so forth. So there's some low-hanging fruit in my view. Well, it's not that low-hanging, but there are some things that could be done that are easier to do than a convention center and probably should be done more immediately than a convention center, although I'm fully supportive of a convention center because I think that, again, that is consistent with what Memphis has to offer the world and how we're going to make our mark, and the rest of this stuff is not necessarily fit.
Right. John, you talked about going to the legislature for an expansion. Is there actually an expansion of the district already on the books in terms of legislation?
Expansion to the west, Bill.
To the west, okay. Of
course, and I always thought the key to the whole project was to expand it all the way to the Civil Rights Museum. Basically, that would be one area, and we've talked about that since 1994, and to tie in these various districts, the Pinch District, Beale Street, and Main District, and I'm glad Pat Howland will be happy to know that we're not taking the Orpheum by eminent domain, so that's a good sign. But I think that Beale Street is a brand, and it's a successful brand, but it needs to be tied into an overall comprehensive plan of tourism. in this community. I don't think we have that. I don't think we've had it for a long time. And I'm not criticizing. CVB does a great job. Kevin Kane, in my judgment, has been a terrific leader in that area. But I do think that we need a new plan. We're in a new century now, and we really haven't had a conversation about our tourism industry since I was on the board in 1998 through 2000.
Well, it seems as if we also have a new market. There is so much that's going on the street that is about the culture and history of
Right.
Beale Street, from Ernest Withers photography to things that are on that block between Hernando or Rufus Thomas and 4th Street. There's really a nice collection there. A. Schwab as well on the block between 2nd and 3rd. It is really kind of a cultural stop for a lot of people to look at the streets.
See, when we did the Withers Museum, I had promised we'd basically take him from an old gas station, abandoned gas station in Mississippi, and given him space on Beale Street. And I think it's very important that, the cultural heritage, music, culture, food are all important in the development of Beale Street. But I think the key area we can grow in is in cultural tourism. And I think the Withers Museum is phenomenal. People should go down there and just see the great history of this city and the civil rights era and musicians and the Negro Baseball League. I mean, that's great stuff. And I hope that will continue on and grow, because I think it's very important.
Just about 5 minutes left here. With how much has the litigation and the ongoing litigation hurt development and hurt? I mean,
Stopped it. It just stopped it cold. Because here and see what people are forgetting. We were only brought into the lawsuit the last 3 years. The paper always reports it's been 15 years. No, we were brought in at the very end. The litigation is between the Beale Street Development Corporation and the city. That's the litigation, and that's going to continue on. And I think the sadness of this whole thing has been when Beale Street was originally fomented and we moved forward, they wanted black participation. So they said, well, let's set this organization up, and they didn't empower it. They didn't tell them what do you want, what are you going to do. And their leadership after Reverend Smith left was non-existent. So they basically, in fact, I think they even abandoned for a while. I think that's going to be an issue that's still going to have to get decided. I think they'll be in court for another year or so, deciding what their role is going to be, or are they going to be involved? We could have left a long time ago. And as you remember, this was all supposed to missing money and all that. That was not anything at all. I mean, we won the lawsuit. And but I think the Beale Street Development Corporation issue is still there. And if that doesn't get solved, they'll have continual lack of growth.
What your thoughts on the role of that organization, Beale Street Development Corp? And
yeah, well, I hadn't been part of the history. I mean, I've been part of city government for the last 2 years, and I can say in that time, it seems to me that we've got too much ongoing litigation, and it's ongoing for years and years and years, and it's without any kind of closure.
Right.
And so, we just need to redirect our targets when it comes to litigation in the city of Memphis, because we are wasting our time and wasting a lot of money on a lot of this stuff.
you mentioned media, bad coverage, some problems. Every time there are shootings, there have been shootings, I should say, on Beale Street. I mean, what do you say to people who say, it's just not safe down there?
Well, actually, it's very safe. We've only had, believe it or not, we've only had 3 lawsuits for personal injury or something like that over 32 years. And that's pretty phenomenal. We have cities, Cleveland was here several months ago, City of Cleveland, looking at our situation. And I think as far as urban downtown districts, I think it's a very safe place to be.
How many people come to Beale Street every year?
Well,
give or
it
take?
depends who you talk to, but if you talk to they mentioned Visit Bureau, they say 4.2 million.
Yeah.
And so you get a lot of people there, and not all those people are good people. One of the problems we had was obviously with 152 and the Plush Club, and that creates a kind of an element of lawlessness but working together, I think we've solved those problems now.
Okay.
And that's basically how I see it.
Right, 2 minutes left, Bill.
Should there be more of an effort to get locals to come to
Oh,
Beale
absolutely.
Street?
Well, you always want locals, but I think historically you are a major part of the tourist industry, and you've got to be your efforts have really got to be to increase leisure tourists and conventioneers and business travelers. And you can't just be for locals, because, as you know, our population is moving away from downtown Memphis. And so, yes, you can attract the people living in Midtown and downtown, but it's harder and harder. And you've got to be a 7-day-a-week attraction. You can't be a 3-day-a-week attraction.
And I should also say that ties into daytime programming. I mean,
Right,
we got to have some
absolutely.
daytime programming
Right.
on
Yeah,
Beale Street, and
absolutely.
that also points to the kind of external manager that we need and the kind of skills that we're looking for. That also ties to we've got to tie in Beale Street with the neighborhood a lot more, and I don't think we've done that as well a job as we could have done. So,
Well, if it expands west, then it links up with Main Street, and then it turns the corner into South Main as well.
The rising tide lifts all the boats, and we need to have better situation between South Main, Beale Street, and really, one of the big white elephants still left is Peabody Place. What are we going to do with a 400,000 square foot vacant building? I mean, that is critical too. More money was put in by the city into Peabody Place than ever was put into Beale Street, even counting the litigation money. So that's a big issue right there. We got to solve that.
For local, just 30 seconds left. Do you ever worry there are too many districts? We did a show on the rebirth of Overton Square last week. You've got Cooper Young. Do you worry there could be too many districts to
No,
and not
because
enough
I think our
residents?
goal should be to the rising tide lifts the boats. I think let's make this an economic city that encourages people to come here. And no, I don't think there could ever be too many.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for being here, Lee Harris. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, and thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. Good night.